What's been clear over the last few sessions that we've done, which has done the thing I hoped it would do, which is great, is to bring together the people from the movements and the people from the grassroots with the people from the sort of institutions, and to build bridges between those spaces where actually we don't often get to spend very much time together.
That we've all got agendas, and that being transparent and open about them is absolutely fundamental. But also, who's funding us? So I think it's fine to be transparent about where your funds come from. It's very good to be transparent about your agenda, but it's really important to be welcoming of the agendas of the people there, and also to not be giving into power when actually the decisions of people there go against power. What surfaces is obviously immediate issues, but it's tying those together and finding out how they connect. Then you can go to a much deeper place. But what I really want to talk about, just very briefly, is the Scottish Climate Assembly. The civil servants wanted a very mediocre question, which saw climate change as something out there and Scotland over here. And those of us from Exeter who were on the stewarding group, we were quite in a minority in terms of our relationship to those in the status quo. Because we were on Zoom, it was one of those meetings where you could talk to people one-to-one. And so at the end of a particular session, people all agreed to having a process whereby the question would be decided by the stewarding group as a whole, rather than us just taking the question from the civil servants. But even though I was in with a Tory member of the Parliament, who I don't particularly agree with politically, even though I was in small groups in that with people who I disagree with, actually where people went to was very much the same place, quite a deep place of really considering the issue. And that was because you had Kevin Anderson, scientist who speaks very, very clearly about the climate crisis. And then you had somebody speaking from a much more status quo position. And when you put them next to each other, it's kind of obvious what kind of crisis we're in. And we had Becky Willis speaking very realistically about the limitations of climate assemblies. And we had Claire Miller speaking about the French Assembly and what was possible there. And people again arrived at quite an ambitious notion of what could be achieved. So the question that we arrived at was very much stronger than the one civil servants wanted. The framing of the whole assembly, the holding of it, was by civil servants. So you can get a great question, you can get a great framing at the start, but if it's controlled by those who are wedded by definition, because of their jobs, to the status quo and not threatening the status quo, then you'll get nowhere. So there's something about the power on the streets that needs to accompany democratic processes. We shouldn't think of them as hived off specialist things that happen over there in a technical way. They need to be utterly connected to passion on the streets.
So one concern I always have when it comes to, for example, being conscious and transparent about what drives your agenda is the limitations we have ourselves in terms of being able to be conscious of that. Power really operates at its most powerful when it becomes a common sense. Okay, when people are not even aware of being under the influence of some form of power or manipulation, in the sense of a restricted frame through which we see the world. And unbeknownst to us, we see the world in a restricted way. And so if we understand that as one dimension of power that is really difficult to get to, that implies it's really difficult for someone to just be conscious of where they're coming from and why they're coming from that, because precisely making that difficult is the way that power works best at.
The idea of, unfortunately, low-income families not being engaged in climate change issues because they're so busy engaged in the problems in everyday life. And that is a real issue for us in Cornwall. We're one of Britain's poorest regions. But I think the biggest thing is that we have to know our audience. When you know your audience, you can tailor what you say to that audience in the language we use, because what I often find in climate movements, the language they use is very, so to say, middle class or academic, and it doesn't resonate with ordinary people. So that for me is a very important point. We have to have accessible language, accessible for everyone to understand. If you ask the ordinary man and woman on the street, what does carbon neutral mean? 1.5, 2 degrees zero. They would have no idea of what we're talking about. Getting our language right, first and foremost, scientists especially. And what we've had in Cornwall, we occupied Cornwall County Hall and we had a big demonstration outside. And we went into the building and we had our first People's Assembly. We had a team who would set the agenda, especially for Cornwall. We invited various coalition groups. We occupied that building every 2 months. And we had a People's Assembly on different issues. What we eventually happened in County Hall is that we actually went in with councillors into the main chambers. And we had a People's Assembly with the councillors in the Cornish Parliament together. So we have our People's Assembly and we collate all the data from that. We pass that on then to our team who meet the council leaders. And for example, Cornwall recently had a citizens' assembly on the decarbonisation of the energy structure in Cornwall. We advocated for that, and now that's been instigated. Who sets the agenda? We set the agenda, the people. I do not trust governments anymore or state agencies to set an agenda, because all I see that governments and state agencies do, they're very detached from the real world of what's really happening. They're so focused on economic growth, and we all know we need degrowth. We also occupied in the summer for 2 weeks solid the county council grounds, and we gave talks and trainings to the public every day. We then went in and occupied the cathedral. We asked if we need to talk, about the seriousness of the crisis, but bring it in within a cost of living context, housing context, and all that. So what we're trying to do is get local councils to pay for our people's assemblies. And we're developing that model. We need robust action. We also need dialogue with our civic representatives. And that's what we're trying to do. But we're not afraid to take action.
I'm from Shared Future. We were paid by Preston City Council to run a people's jury on climate change. The agenda was set by an advisory group. So the advisory group, classic citizens, jury, citizens assembly process, oversight panel, advisory group, they set the agenda, they set the question. The advisory group is made up of local authority, public sector, voluntary community sector, including XR, and the private sector. So they came up with this question: how can we in Preston work together to address the opportunities and challenges of climate change in a way that is fair to everyone? But we said to the jury right from the start, what should we focus on in our deliberations? But we didn't want to just say, so what do you want to talk about? A long part of the process was about preparing them for making that decision about what they wanted to talk about. What we did first was we had a session on what is climate change. So the commentator was selected by the oversight panel, the advisory group. Then another session was where are the emissions coming from, specifically in Preston. And then we said to the group, okay, we're going to explore now, how does change happen? So we got them to do lots of personal reflections on what change can look like individually, in their own experiences, in their own communities, their own neighbourhoods, nationally, globally, in the past and in the present, to get them to think a bit about what change looks like, how it happens, what sustains it, what leads to it, etc. And then we did with the group some introductions to the theories of change without using that language. So we brought in some external people that were able to explore with them what different theories of change look like, so that they're better able to understand before figuring out what it is they're going to talk about, what change can look like. And finally, we did some power mapping. So we did some very practical power mapping activities with the group where we got them to think about who has the power to influence how we address climate change in Preston. So finally, after they'd done all that, we said, what should we focus on to them? And this involved lots of small group talk and conversation and an attempt by us to build some consensus with them. And then they identified housing, food and transport as the key topics that they'd like to spend more time investigating. And then the remaining sessions were focused on those topics.
One of the things that seems quite consistent is this sense of people needing to sort of at the same time have access to education and be able to broaden their understanding of how things work in order to be able to feel like they can go in and sort of wrestle with the world out there. If you don't know what it's made up of, then you don't know how to go and change things about it. That completely relates, I guess, to this point about unblocking power and people's lack of belief in their own power. Quite concerning that there's such a sort of limited level of political education throughout a lot of parts of this country.
The organizer of this had thought that a good topic would be, what kind of an environment do we want for our children? Thinking climate, thinking that this would be a topic that would bridge across differences. What happened is that at the close of the evening, one of the participants kind of tentatively said, do we have to talk about this question? And I was really curious. And I said, well, this is supposed to be for you. What do you want to be talking about? And she said, well, here we are talking about the environment that we want for our children. And I'm concerned about, what environment does my child face when they leave the house? Are they going to be shot at in the street? Right? So that's the environment that I care about. And so the next morning when we started again, we went in a pretty different direction. We were talking about the violence in Durham, North Carolina, and violence from the police and danger in the streets and that kind of environment and what can be done about it. The design is very important, and doing all this pre-work is super important. And the more of that you've done, probably the less surprises you will have in store. But still, there's an element of just really being able to be flexible in the moment and listen to people about where they want to go.
I felt that we needed to do something to show people what an assembly was. And if we went into our communities and actually strategically designed them in order to empower the community to take agency over their futures, that we would be able to get many, many, many more people onto the streets when we needed them. So how do you actually talk about systems change? How do you actually do that? So the story that I wanted to tell my community was that we should decide that we are citizens of our local community, where we have agency over our future, and we will work together to create the future we want with a sense of hope, purpose, and belonging. So the model was basically to address the three issues which seemed to me to be the most important. Before I launched the thing, I spoke to at least 300 people in and around our local community. What I said is, what would you think if we were to become self-sufficient in locally grown, agroecologically grown food? Everybody seemed to think that was a good idea. And it wasn't a difficult thing to sell because we were self-sufficient in the 50s and 60s. So maybe we could go back to where we were, but do it in a rather more friendly way to nature. I also suggested that why don't we have our own community energy company and become self-sufficient in energy? Most people said, right, that's a great idea. Could we actually do this? And I said, well, I have no idea whether we do this. The question is, do we want to do it? And the thing that was going to hold all this together was mental well-being. The question there is, how can we support our community, or what can we do in our community to address mental well-being by changing the culture, by changing the language around it, where it's okay not to be okay, where it's possible to bring people into the community and get them to organize themselves together. So we launched our first assembly. And the question, how might we support ALY as a community to become self-sufficient in sustainably grown local food, eventually producing enough to feed the town and its environments, much as we did in the 50s and 60s. That's designed specifically to keep away anybody who is a climate denier. The idea is to bring people in who actually want to do this. And we were oversubscribed by 100%, and it's taken off. It's taken a long time to get the rest of the powers that be in Wales to understand what we were trying to do. But once they got it, they've got behind us, and there's a possibility of the model now being rolled out across Wales. And we're able to get the grant funding that we need in order to make it happen.
I always see the tree as a fundamental symbol of democracy because people meet under trees. Village discussions take place under trees, but trees are a fundamental symbol. So thinking about how we can get this feeling of empowerment to people using various different types of engagement that reflect the theme of democratic participation and empowerment. Think about and come back to us with some further ideas and explorations.